Amos Guiora, law professor at the University of Utah, retired lieutenant colonel with the Israel Defense Forces, and counterterrorism expert. Thank you so much for being part of Three Questions.
Always a pleasure.
It's been almost 3 years since you've been with us. Tell us what you have been doing in the interim.
Other than talking with you?
Yeah, yes. And dreaming of talking with me.
That's exactly right. Shortly after we met the first time, I wrote a book, or I had a book come out called The Crime of Complicity, The Bystander in the Holocaust. And that book and book talks and courses thereafter have been a significant aspect of my professional career since then. I'm now working on a new book called The Armies of Enablers, which is enablers in sexual assaults. In the interim, I had a book come out that in many ways compares President Trump to Prime Minister Netanyahu, a quasi-biography of Earl Warren, and I have a new book coming out with a colleague of mine on the Miranda trial.
You've been typing a lot.
You know, like this.
Well, we have seen hostilities in recent months between the United States and Iran, with the shooting down of a drone, the killing of a U.S. contractor, the storming of the U.S. embassy in Baghdad, and then the killing of Iranian General Soleimani. On its face, those look like pretty dire developments. How tense, how difficult, how dire is the situation right now between the United States and Iran?
I don't think it's dire. I think there's a spike in activity. There's clearly a spike in rhetoric. But I also think that the Iranian response to the killing of Soleimani was somewhere between mild to muted. It's a little bit of what I would call a set piece play. I did X, you did Y. I don't think that the Iranian response goes outside of that swim lane. I think that the president's reaction to their reaction could have been handled a little bit better. I don't think there was a need for the president to use the phrase that the Iranians are standing down. There was something a little bit insulting. It was gratuitous. Sometimes it's okay to be silent. There's no harm in that. I'm not sure that's his style. I think that the shooting down of the Ukrainian plane last week threw a curveball into all this, because it forced the Iranians to do something that no regime likes to do, which is to admit a mistake. Unrelated to that, there have been, this domestic unrest in Iran, unrelated to Soleimani, unrelated to the plane, but it's all related, because I think the demonstrators who were protesting anyway against the regime used the Ukrainian plane and the initial denials of the Iranian regime to significantly and heavily criticize the regime for yet again not telling the truth. So I think if the Iranian regime perhaps would like to keep the world's focus on Soleimani, but I'm not sure the Iranian public is going to cooperate with that.
When we talk about the Iranian public, we look at those mass demonstrations and the funerals with everybody holding a picture of General Soleimani. Right. And the fascinating thing for those of us who sit and observe is that the president, President Trump, describes him as a terror mastermind who's killed many Americans and many, many others, who and in his justification of attacking him and killing him, was saying that another wave of attacks was imminent. You have the foreign minister, Iranian foreign minister Javad Zarif, describing Soleimani as a lover of the people and a people's leader, and in fact in Baghdad on a mission to stabilize and to quell the anti-American sentiment when he was killed. Which is he? Is he a mastermind terrorist, or is he a leader of the people, a stabilizing leader?
Well, first of all, he's not a terrorist because he happens to be a general in an army. And generals in an army may be problematic, but they're not terrorists. And I found the president's terminology to be troubling, is a polite word, absolutely and totally incorrect is a more accurate articulation of that, because Soleimani was not a terrorist. He may be a bad guy. He's a general in an army and we deliberately attacked a general in another army, which is an attack on a sovereign. Was he a peace-loving, warm-hearted guy? No, he's not. He was a bad guy. In many ways, I think it's safe to say the world's a better place with him no longer part of the world. That's fine. But you also need to be very clear in your articulation, A, as to who it is you're killing and why you're killing that individual. So we've seen in the last 4, 5, 6 days significant inconsistency from the administration as to why we killed him. The president said that there were other embassies that he was planning on attacking. The Secretary of Defense has backed away from that, suggesting that that's not quite correct. Secretary of State Pompeo says the president was correct, that there was an imminent threat. The Secretary of Defense says there's no indication of that imminent threat. So unless they're deliberately engaged in very sophisticated disinformation, there's a sense a little bit of the right hand doesn't know from the left hand. But what is correct is that, I mean, correct in terms of fact, is that the United States killed a general in another army. What I found interesting is that the Iranians, I'm sure they consult with lawyers, have made the decision seemingly not to come to the United Nations and say the United States of America conducted an act of war against the sovereign called Iran. They have not taken that route, but for the president to define Soleimani as an arch-terrorist, I think that was the expression, is just absolutely incorrect.
So what do we take then from these mass demonstrations at his funeral and everybody marching with his pictures? I mean, was that, number one, constructed, and number two, how sincere was that grief?
It's an excellent question. I've seen reports, you know, there's so much out there in social media, you know better than I do, that you have to be very careful on what you read, that people were, quote unquote, encouraged to participate in the funeral. Were people paid to participate in the funeral? So I don't know, because I wasn't there. Regimes like Iran are for understandable reasons, show is important to them. And this was a quote-unquote massive outpouring. How genuine was it? I would think that from the perspective of the guy in the street, a much greater, more pressing concern for him is putting food on the table for his kids rather than whether or not the United States killed a general. And so was the funeral, in terms of the massive outpouring, was that engineered? Maybe one day we'll learn. I would imagine that those from his community, his family, were genuinely upset. Does that extend to, how far out does that extend? I'm skeptical.
Terminology is always important. Language is important. Those who are describing the killing of General Soleimani, those opposed to it or those critical of it, are calling it an assassination. Was it an assassination?
No. Assassination, according to law, is particularly international, especially in this context, can only be conducted against someone who's a political leader of another country. So if, for instance, you kill, or of your own country, so when Lee Harvey Oswald assassinates President Kennedy, John Hinckley sought to assassinate President Ronald Reagan. Soleimani was not a political leader. He's a general. Was he assassinated? No. Was he a target of a drone attack? Yes. Was he assassinated? No. Was he executed? No.
What difference does it make?
Well, those of us who are wedded to the law give weight to the importance of a word, to the significance. And it's also important to remember there's an executive order from, I believe, in the Ford era, in aftermath of various CIA operations, that the United States cannot kill a leader of a foreign country. Soleimani is not that, so in that sense, the executive order was not violated. And no, we didn't assassinate. And is there importance in the terminology? Yeah, I think because if you use the word assassinate, it's as if you're making him into a political leader, which he was not.
Was it an act of war?
That's a really interesting question that I've struggled with in the past week. I think you know that I wrote an op-ed that was published by the Salt Lake Tribune, and I've been asked subsequently, do I think that the United States committed an act of war, conducted an act of war against the Iranians? I can see why there are those who suggest that the answer to that is yes, which is why, as I mentioned earlier, I've been surprised that the Iranians have not gone down that particular avenue. I think it would have been very interesting should they have chosen to do so. Was it an act of war? Probably more yes than no. Unlike, and there's been confusion on this, when President Obama ordered the hit on Osama bin Laden was an arch-terrorist, but he was not a general in an army. So he clearly was not assassinated, and he was a non-state actor. Soleimani is a state actor, and I think it's important to distinguish between Category A and Category B.
The downing of that Ukrainian airliner that was taking off from Tehran, what is the deeper backstory on that?
So the easy answer is somebody made a mistake, which also took the Iranians 3 or so days to acknowledge the mistake, even though pictures came out right away of the missile hitting the plane. I assume that conspiracy theorists and or skeptics will roll their eyes at the thought of an innocent mistake or a tragic mistake, and will say that perhaps there was somebody on that plane who was of interest to the Iranians. I don't have the plane manifest available to me. It's not the first time that planes have been shot down in these kinds of conflicts. I don't remember if it was last year or 2 years ago that I believe it was the Russians who shot down a plane that was flying over, approaching the Black Sea. Was that a mistake? Not a mistake? Did the Russians acknowledge it? To the best of my recollection, Putin would never acknowledge a mistake under any conditions.
Not publicly.
Not publicly, exactly. In the 1970s, Israel had information that an arch terrorist, somebody named George Khabash, was on a plane, and if I recall correctly, the Israeli Air Force signaled to the pilot. There's a way to signal to the pilot to land your plane. The pilot, I believe, was a Libyan plane. Libyan Airlines ignored the Israeli Air Force, and the plane was shot down with the assumption that George Khabash was on the plane, and he was not on the plane. And that was, that's a terrible tragedy.
With the current conflict between the United States and Iran right now, it's curious that the Russians have remained silent. The Chinese have remained silent. We don't hear from some of the other states that we normally hear from in these kinds of situations. Why do you suppose that is?
That's a really interesting question. When we think about when you and I were kids, I've learned today we're the same age. When you and I were kids, the Middle East was Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Egypt. Fast forward to where we are today, the Middle East starts somewhere out in North Africa, goes up to the Caucasus, and comes down almost into India. The swath of land is enormous, including obviously Turkey and obviously Iran. I think the chess game is far more complicated than it was when you and I were kids. The Russians have a clear interest, and they made it very clear, in Syria. I think here they're quiet because perhaps they're not sure exactly how this is going to shake itself out. The Chinese also, on some level, have an interest in the Middle East, but not as direct as the Russian interest. As far as I know, the Turks have been very quiet, and it's not in his nature to be quiet. He's a little bit of a rabble-rouser, President Erdogan. I think on some level, the Chinese, the Russians, the Israelis are very quiet by direct order of Prime Minister Netanyahu. And the Turks, I think because it's felt geopolitically, the smart thing to do is to leave the arena solely to the Americans and to the Iranians rather than intervene, for now, period. But we both know that tomorrow Putin may feel the need to say something. But I think that they are all keeping a respectful distance from the spike of last week in terms of Iran and the United States. The ones who have not been quiet, who I think feel trapped in the middle, are the Iraqis. I think that the Iraqis are clearly tired of the American presence in Iraq. I think that has been made very clear. And I would think that the events in the embassy last week, from their perspective, drove home the point of, from their perspective, enough is enough of the American presence. I think that from President Trump's perspective, when he took over office in January 2017, I don't think he really ever thought he would be engaged in this Iraq-Iran, I don't know, conflict is the right word, situation. And I think in many ways, at least from my perspective, what I see is a sense of no strategy, but kind of tactics from lurching from situation to situation.
The last time you were here, we were talking about the North Korean situation and which got awful close to actual hostilities between the United States and North Korea. Now here we are talking about the United States and Iran. At that time, you were talking about how Kim Jong-un was testing President Trump, who was fairly new in office at the time. How is one situation informing the other? What did we learn with the very close hostilities, almost hostilities with North Korea, that is playing out now with Iran?
So as I was driving here, I recalled our first conversation indeed about North Korea. And I think that indeed he was testing him and he was testing him. I think North Korea has taken a back seat to the Iranian situation. You know, there's a theory in geopolitics, which we've seen this in Israel, quote unquote, the boss has gone crazy, the madman theory. Mm-hmm. And I think from the perspective of world leaders, when they look at President Trump, I would imagine that they see something that is utterly and totally unpredictable. And if you're dealing with someone who's very unpredictable, it's very difficult to try to assess his next moves, all right? This is a chess game, which I think goes back to your previous question about the Russians, the Chinese, and I included the Turks and the Israelis, because there is this unpredictability about President Trump, and I think there's no sense about who advises him, about how you try to assess the president's next moves, unlike with previous presidents who foreign leaders had insight through their contacts with the State Department, CIA, Defense Department. I don't think that exists here. I think that in many ways President Trump's a one-man show, relying perhaps occasionally on Vice President Pence, maybe occasionally on Secretary of State Pompeo, clearly on those standing with him in the buffet line in Florida. And I would think that for a foreign leader or foreign leaders trying to assess President Trump's thinking on a particular issue must be literally almost impossible. And I do think if you're tying your two questions together, I think that's why you're seeing this taking a step back from the Russians et al. From the perspective of the North Koreans, that situation really has, I don't know, what's after the backseat, the trunk of the car? Mm-hmm. That seems to be where that situation is at the moment.
How does President Trump's unpredictability, in your words, serve U.S. security?
That is an excellent question. I think the first response is how we define security. Do we define it here limited domestically, internationally? Does that also suggest a level of alliance with traditional allies?
Well, let's say internationally and with our allies. How does it serve U.S. security overseas and secondarily here at home?
So I was, raised in the tradition of America and its allies, and the traditional Western allies, NATO. I mean, that's, again, think back when we were kids. That is not really the narrative of today. There's a go it alone aspect to President Trump. Does that enhance or minimize the personal safety of Americans? There are different metrics. One can say that in the past, he's been president 3 years, that in the last 3 years, the international terrorism that occurred under Bush and or Obama against Americans has not occurred. But there's been a change in the nature and the evolving face of terrorism that here today in the United States, I think that the threat domestically is not the post 9/11 threat of the Islamic extremism. Seems to me that the threat today in America in terms of domestic terrorism or security, to use your word, is white nationalism. And that's something that largely that Presidents Bush and Obama did not have to confront. It's something that President Trump is confronted with. I am saddened that every time a white nationalist, white supremacist commits an act of terrorism, the president's immediate response is to suggest the person has mental illness, mental disease. And I think that does a profound disservice, because he would never say that about an Islamic extremist. So in terms of security, I think we have to recognize there's been a shift domestically. Internationally, because of the changing nature of how the president conducts his foreign affairs, I don't know if it leaves Americans vulnerable, but I think that the kind of coalition that came together after 9/11, which I think was to President Bush's credit. I think that President Trump, were there, God forbid, to be a 9/11 today, I think that President Trump would be very hard-pressed to re-engage the international community the way that President Bush did after 9/11. And I think that if the way that Trump has conducted foreign affairs today, if there was to be, again, God forbid, a 9/11 tomorrow, I think we would see a profound impact of the disentangling from alliances.
We have come through a period where terrorism was such a shock to our systems that it really did leave us on our heels psychologically as a people. Everyone, Americans and everyone else who became victims of terror. Anymore, though, it is not uncommon for we Americans and others to punish the terrorists and take effective steps to prevent terrorism. How much does President Trump's leadership style play into that scenario? To the point where terrorists realize that here's a man who is, because he's unpredictable, may or may not use diplomacy and probably will not. And those who dare to cross him are going to be very sorry they did. How much does that play into where we are now in that terrorism picture?
In terms of the international scenario, clearly ISIS has been hit. I don't think ISIS was defeated. I found that statement puzzling by the president. Call it, cheap politics. I think combining your question and our previous comments, from the perspective of terrorists, international terrorists, because of his unpredictability, maybe there is an advantage to that. I mean, I can see why somebody would make that argument. But what worries me in the context of the unpredictability is very much the loosening of what I referred to earlier in terms of alliances with others. So there's maybe a positive and a negative to that unpredictability. That does not, I think, play itself out here domestically. I think that the white supremacists, the white nationalists, whether or not Trump is unpredictable or not, on some level they must feel that his comments, I take you back to Charlottesville. I thought that if a president ever misspoke egregiously, it was after Charlottesville. I thought his words were awful. And that might well be interpreted by them as a little bit of a nod and a wink. And that
empowering.
Empowering. That's exactly right. That's a great word. In a way that he would never empower, for instance, Islamic terrorists. And I think that there's an inconsistency there which I personally find troubling. Different forms of terrorism, different forms of terrorists, but there's a need for consistency in how you respond to it. And you said your words earlier, words matter, terminology matters. And I thought that what the president said after Charlottesville was he could not have been more wrong.
President Trump has come out very clearly saying that Iran, during his term in office, will never have a nuclear weapon. Is that kind of concern warranted? The Iranians are clearly have been. I'm not sure today, as in early 2020, the Iranians have been very focused on developing a nuclear capability. Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel drew that magical red line in the sand, or red line on the chart at the UN, and he's been very focused on this. And I think Trump has been similarly focused that on his watch, Iran will not go nuclear. Those of us who live in the Middle East, as do I, the thought of a nuclear Iran is unsettling. But I want to add that I am convinced that the Iranian leadership is rational and that they understand that to use a nuclear bomb weapon, the consequences would be so overwhelmingly dire that that's not a route they want to go. On the other hand, right, they decided to come to an agreement about the nuclear capability
because of the effectiveness of the sanctions. And I think that a cash-strapped or a cash-strained Iran is a direct result of the sanctions which were imposed on them because of the nuclear capability. And that may well tie into how we began the conversation. The domestic unrest in Iran may well be as an economic result of the sanctions. Will they continue with their nuclear desire? You know, anything is possible, but I would think that at the moment the Iranian regime has far larger issues to deal with than going nuclear or not. And President Trump, like Prime Minister Netanyahu, have been very, very clear on this. It's also important to add, you know, in the Middle East, the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Right.
And there's an interesting alliance, is way, way, way too strong of a word, but there's an interesting narrowing or coming together, again, very, very, very loose, between Israel and the Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Saudi Arabia, again, in the principle of my enemy is my friend, because the Saudis and Dubai and Abu Dhabi and the Emirates, they mutually loathe and disdain the Iranians. Right. And they view Iran as a threat. And so it's interesting to see this, I don't know, something that's being woven together. That's, again, too strong of a word, but the United States, Israel, and the Emirates with their focus on Iran. I think that's something that's well worth paying attention to.
What happens if Iran does get a nuclear weapon? What does that do to the stability in the Middle East, and what does that do to the world's security in general?
In a colloquial expression, I would say that would be really bad. In a more sophisticated response, I would say that would have profound consequences on global stability, including Middle East stability, if not broader than that. Again, remember how we now redrew the Middle East. The map is so broad. The Iranians would have a nuclear weapon, not for defensive purposes, but ostensibly for offensive purposes. That would require the countries immediately in that concentric circle, clearly of Israel, to have to ask itself difficult questions. Clearly, I think it would require the United States to ask difficult questions. I don't know what the Turks would do with it. I don't know what the Russians would do with it. I don't know what the Saudis would do with it. Would Saudi Arabia then say, now, hey, if the Iranians have a bomb, we want to have a bomb also? You know, nuclear proliferation is not a good thing. And even though I said a minute ago that I genuinely believe that the Iranian regime is rational, I genuinely believe that. The problem with having a bomb with a rational regime is one day perhaps the rational regime is replaced by an irrational regime. And then what's the expression? Houston, we have a problem. Then I would say, Houston, we have a problem. I think that the determined efforts over the years to dissuade the Iranians from developing nuclear capability, those efforts are truly important. And I certainly hope that they will continue. Was the agreement with the Iranians the way to go about doing that? Is there a way to go something more effective down the road? I don't know, but I really genuinely believe, to your point about stability, instability, a nuclearized Iran would, I think, enhance instability.
Could that be a flashpoint for either a world war, a nuclear world war, or?
No, I don't buy into that, because I think that
because here's what I'm suggesting, and that's this: if indeed Iran having a nuclear weapon is destabilizing in that environment, in that region, if indeed they would only have it for offensive purposes, it is assumable that, in your terminology, a regime change to an irrational regime change would bring about a flashpoint that is almost unavoidable.
I think that would be, so right, so even though there's what I refer to as the rational regime today and the fear of irrationality, first of all, I'd be, never bet your last dollar, because you have to feed your kids.
Right.
I'm willing to bet my second to last dollar that Iran will never go nuclear. A, because it'll be prevented, and B, because I don't think they're really in a position to focus on that at the moment. I think there's a lot of rhetoric. You've been to the Middle East. You know that in the Middle East we're all about rhetoric, and a lot of noise.
But as Benjamin Netanyahu Prime Minister of Israel, points out, you don't build an ICBM as Iran has and then put TNT on the tip.
That's right.
And you don't have secret laboratories deep inside the mountains to
That's right. And
enrich uranium. And it points us in a direction that even with a rational regime, as you're pointing out in Iran, that they are headed in that direction to have a nuclear weapon and that they would intend to use it.
I am going to respectfully disagree. I'm very, very skeptical of whether that they will ever have one, and I can't imagine that they would ever use it because I think they genuinely understand the consequences are so overwhelming.
Then how would they leverage that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think we also need to be realistic about Iran today. In many ways, Iran today is an isolated country. Think about the last week, and I thought your question about the Russians and the Chinese goes well to this point. I don't see any international support on their behalf after Soleimani's murder. The streets in the Arab capitals are quiet. I've not seen any demonstrations, whether government-led or not government-led, in Cairo, in Amman, well, in Damascus, I don't know what's left of Damascus, but particularly of Cairo or Amman, or in the West Bank. I haven't seen any outpouring of support, outpouring of emotion on behalf of Soleimani and or the Iranian regime. I've not seen criticism in Europe other than the obligatory criticism of America for the day of the week. I mean, that's just obligatory, right? The Russians and the Chinese, as you correctly noted, somewhere between silent to reticent. The Iranians, they look this way, they look this way, they look this way, and they're not seeing support anywhere. Combine that with the effectiveness of the sanctions from an economic perspective and the clear domestic unrest that they're facing, I would think that in the list of priorities, which all leaders have to have, the bomb is probably, if this is number one, is somewhere down here.
The Trump administration has come out and the president has said that ISIS has been defeated and drawn back, and I know you disagree necessarily with that, but the threat from ISIS has been greatly reduced.
It's been minimized.
At this point. But there are those who very wisely say that, okay, well, ISIS may be, for all intents and purposes, off the table for now, but they're going to be replaced by something far more horrific and far more dire than ISIS ever was. Do you agree with that, and where will that happen?
So that ties in to the broader Iranian discussion that if we think about Iran, what makes Iran, I think the correct word, I don't want to exaggerate, dangerous, problematic to dangerous, somewhere in there, is their use of proxies. So in southern Lebanon, there's Hezbollah, which has been engaged in conflict with Israel for years, who does Iran's bidding in southern Lebanon. It is the government in southern Lebanon. In the Gaza Strip, there's Hamas, and Hamas has rejected Iranian efforts to impose themselves on Hamas. But that's distinct from the Islamic Jihad, which is another organization in the Gaza Strip, which is Iranian-funded, Iranian-supported, Iranian-armed. The Iranian proxies are perhaps, given the present state of Iran, the proxies who do their bidding pose threats, not existential threats. Hezbollah is not an existential threat on Israel, neither is the Islamic Jihad. But those are active terrorist organizations acting on Iran's behalf. And I think, to divert for a second, it's important to note that Iran, even though I genuinely believe at the moment is this isolated country, the fact that they have these well-developed, sophisticated proxies is something that's really important to take into consideration when we think about Iran. You know, one of the difficulties in the Middle East is this whole notion of procrastination, of trying to predict where we go from here. ISIS comes after Al-Qaeda, which is different from Taliban, Hezbollah, Hamas. every time you think you quote unquote defeat, though I don't believe in that you defeat terrorism. I've never bought into that. That's why I reject the term war on terrorism. It's not a football game. Safe to assume that there's always going to be the next, the next actor. ISIS was awful, and I think we need to be very honest about ISIS. They, in terms of human rights violations, I mean, they're bad. Al-Qaeda was obviously bad. The Taliban was obviously bad. Will there be, another group that steps to the fore, given the fact that ISIS has been weakened? My guess is the answer to that is yes, because there are always those who are absolutely committed, whether it's to the caliphate, whether it's to defeating this regime or that regime. These are seriously bad actors. But I think we also need to take note of the following. The civil war, if that's the right term, in Syria has created a number of disparate groups. On the other hand, none of these disparate groups have been able to defeat the regime, the Assad regime, which, by the way, is also a horrible regime. Yeah. You never know where the funding is going to come from. You never know who has an interest in funneling money to create something, yet another organization. But I don't, my assumption is, to your question, I assume there'll be another ISIS. I assume they'll be as bad as ISIS, if not more, because that is the narrative or the paradigm that we're in at the moment. The question is always, for instance, Hezbollah and Israel. Will Hezbollah do something? I mean, there have been all kinds of threats, but again, rhetoric. I haven't seen anything concrete.
Here, Utah is sitting essentially in the middle of the United States. We're landlocked here. We don't have any exposed coasts of any kind.
Right.
We're thousands and thousands of miles from where many of these conflicts are taking place, whether it's in the Middle East or in Afghanistan or the Balkans or wherever else it's happening all over the world. Why should Utahns pay attention to these conflicts and these hostilities that happen in these far-flung places?
For a number of different reasons. One, I don't know the numbers, perhaps you do. There are X number of Utahns who have family members who are serving in the military. I think that's a direct reason to be directly involved or engaged. Two, I genuinely believe that world events impact markets, impact economies. And I think for any Utahn who is concerned about his or her economy, about their investments, about their stocks, or whatever people do with their money, because of the importance of oil in the Middle East, because of the importance of the Middle East to global economies, I think that absolutely is reason to be engaged. People travel, and traveling has whatever risks it may or may not have. And fourth, I genuinely believe, thanks to shows such as yours, which educate the public, we have a presidential election in 10 months. Yeah. Foreign policy is a critical aspect of the campaign process, and I think it's incumbent upon the American electorate to be engaged with what's happening in the world. Again, whether it's the Balkans, the Middle East, wherever it is. And perhaps if you don't feel an immediate threat, I think that foreign affairs is so critical to how America conducts itself domestically and internationally. I think, not to repeat, but I think it's really incumbent upon all of us to know what's happening in the world.
You have made yourself informed about conflicts around the globe, whether it's in the Middle East, in Asia, in Afghanistan, in wherever it's happening. You're an expert on counterterrorism. You're an expert on these conflicts. As you have pondered over these many years of studying all of this, where do you see all of it winding up? What is the key to lasting peace on this planet?
Former Israeli Prime Minister Rabin, who was assassinated by a Jewish terrorist, used the phrase, and there's a question whether he coined it or the first Israeli Prime Minister, Ben Gurion, coined the phrase, but give credit to both Ben Gurion and Rabin. that you fight conflict like there's no peace, and you fight for peace like there's no conflict. I subscribe to that theory. I'm not naive. I'm not an idealist. I would like to think that I'm, rooted and grounded in reality. As you know, I spent a number of years deeply involved in the implementation of the peace process between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And I did so, A, because it was a great honor to be included in that. Two, as my wife told me, once you're invited, you have no choice because it's so incredibly important. So I go into these things wide-eyed. I'm not, rose-colored and all that. I think on the one hand, we have to recognize that conflict is, I don't know if inevitable, but conflict is a reality. I think simultaneous to that, it's incumbent upon us to try to resolve conflict or to manage conflict. So, there's an interesting notion that you don't resolve conflicts. You manage them. You put them into some kind of a convenient 2x2 box. And if that leads to stability, I'm all for that. If I reflect back to the years I spent on implementation of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, when I think back, some things we were resolving, some things we were managing. There's this interesting field which I've only became aware of it in the last few months when I was invited to a conference in Belgium in November, strategic communications or diplomatic strategic communications, with the understanding we're not going to necessarily resolve, but we're going to create a framework that enables you to live your life and me to live my life. Does that mean that conflict may not occur? It may. But if we have mechanisms in place, including communication mechanisms that enable us to discuss, not to resolve, to manage. You have your piece, I have my piece. That strikes me that may well be the route to go forward, primarily, not exclusively, primarily because the world of the state actor, state A, state B, that's being clearly replaced by a world of state and non-state actors. That's why I think that the whole notion of grandiose, post-World War I Versailles peace process, that's not going to happen. I think the best we can hope to do, again, as I say, is to manage conflicts, to communicate with each other, and absolutely to recognize that you have force, I have force, and how do we limit force with the understanding that conflict is an inherent part of the human condition.
Finally, my last question to you is this. In light of the tensions between the United States and Iran presently, how do we avoid an armed conflict with them? How do we avoid a war with Iran?
First of all, toning down rhetoric. That's why I found President Trump's last week, they're standing down. I just found that gratuitous. I think it's really important, and this I learned obviously in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We have to respect each other's weak points. You have your vulnerabilities, I have my vulnerabilities. You have your domestic needs, I have my domestic needs. I have my audience, you have your audience. And I think if we were to pay closer attention to that, we could create wiggle room for you to, to vent, to articulate, because you have to placate, I have to placate. And if we understand that the exercise is all about, quote unquote, venting under the guise of some kind of mutual interest of conflict avoidance, if that's the way this plays out, that strikes me as a pretty reasonable, I don't know if resolution, but a pretty reasonable containment of clearly the spike that has struck us in the last week or so.
Well, Amos Guiora, law professor at the University of Utah, retired lieutenant colonel with the Israel Defense Forces, and counterterrorism expert. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much
for being part of.
My pleasure. Thank you.